Okay, so I haven't recorded a video in this format in a while, and I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do this one, so y'all are just gonna have to forgive me for any rust. But today I wanted to talk about something important now that we're leading into the regular season in a month or so, and that is that I think the New Orleans Pelicans are kind of cooked. Now, when I say that, I mean that the New Orleans Pelicans, as presently constructed, are not good enough to contend, and because of the investments they've made in key players on their roster, I think they are putting themselves in a deeper and deeper hole with every passing day with the way they're building around Zion Williamson. I just want to say, first of all, that I'm not a Pelicans hater, and I'm actually a huge fan of Zion historically, but I really sort of hopped off the train. I hopped off the bandwagon when they got rid of Lonzo Ball, because to me, that's sort of where the problems with this roster started. Lonzo Ball was like the perfect connector for them. He was a point guard that could hit threes at a decent rate and defend the perimeter very, very well. He was also an awesome passer and was a perfect lob thrower for Zion, which made his job a lot easier, especially in transition. We've all seen the highlights at this point. But when they lost Zion in free agency for nothing and then replaced him with CJ McCollum, obviously CJ is also one of the best point guards in the NBA, and we saw that Lonzo's career pretty much fell off a cliff once he got to Chicago because of all the injuries. But I think that now the critical infrastructure of this team, now that they're continuing to build around Zion, it just doesn't really fit anymore. I think the biggest problem that we can look at with the current Pelicans roster is not CJ, though. It's definitely Brandon Ingram. Brandon Ingram is sort of contradictory to the way they want to play with Zion, because if you are going to build around Zion, you need to supply him with a ton of floor spacing and guys who are not necessarily going to stop the ball. And I don't necessarily think Brandon Ingram is like a bad player. I don't think it's impossible to fit him with Zion, but I think the lack of spacing at other positions and the other ball handlers on this team, as well as Brandon's unwillingness to improve on his three-point shot, which I think he could very easily do if he just locked himself in the gym for the season. They had one of the best shooting coaches in the NBA on their roster, and he still didn't really take, I think, more than 4 a game last year. Because Brandon Ingram lacks in that area, and because he loves to isolate in the mid-range, he just doesn't really fit that well with Zion. And even though he's actually a pretty decent playmaker, especially in the pick and roll, he can make some pretty tough passes, and he's a very strong mid-range offensive weapon, like one of the best mid-range shooters in the NBA. I just don't really think he fits all that well on this team, and there's a reason they've been actively shopping him all season. I think the biggest problem with this team, though, is that in order for Zion to really work now, that his production is a little bit more limited, and that they don't necessarily have the elite infrastructure on the perimeter. I think if they don't have the perfect infrastructure on the perimeter, then the only player they can really pair with Zion, the perfect player they could pair with Zion, would be a stretched big that can also defend on the other end. Because this is pretty obvious, and many people have made this point before. Alex Soups actually just made an entire video about this. But Zion Williamson is a player who is undersized at the 5, and really undersized at the 4 sometimes, just because of his lack of height. And he's not an elite defender, nor is he a very good three-point shooter. But he can kick it out to the perimeter, and he can just fucking demolish you on the inside around the basket, which is where he does most of his work. And so the perfect player to put next to him would be like a Brook Lopez, a guy who shoots like 6 to 7 threes a game, and then is also a big center who can defend the paint at a high level on the other end. This would mitigate a ton of Zion's weaknesses, and I have actually sort of slated Zion in at center until they sort of make an addition like this, because I think there's a chance that they don't really have another center on the roster even, because they've lost Jonas Valanciunas, and the only 2 centers they have now are Yves Missi and Daniel Tice, unless you slide Zion to the 5. And once you're adding DeJounte Murray, you've got CJ McCollum, you've got DeJounte, you've got Brandon Ingram, and then you have to pick between Trey Murphy and Herb Jones, or you slide Zion to the 5 anyway. Or you take both those guys off the bench, which I think is probably the worst option, because those are 2 of your most useful off-ball role players, and they play critical roles in your defense and your three-point shooting infrastructure, which is, again, something that DeJounte Murray and Brandon Ingram don't really do at a super high level. I mean, DeJounte used to be a very, very good defender. He's maybe fallen off a little bit. I think he could definitely get back to an all-defensive level, but he's not an amazing catch-and-shoot three-point shooter, and he's going to want the ball in his hands. But Trey Murphy and Herb Jones, like, those can just be catch-and-shoot guys on offense, even though I think Trey Murphy could be even more than that. Like, that's not coming for a long time. The ideal Pelicans roster should be focusing on Herb Jones and Trey Murphy in the starting lineup, bringing in one elite ball-dominant point guard, and then allowing Herb Jones and Trey Murphy to sort of develop as secondary creators beside that player, as well as Zion. And then you just need a stretched big. You need a defensive big. It's even more than you need a stretch big. You need a big that can really guard at a very, very high level. Miles Turner would be amazing for this team. But the problem is that player is just not really available. Like, those players exist, but they don't exist as frequently as a lot of the other players that this team could use. So in order for them to, I think, maximize their window with Zion, they're going to have to get more creative with the way they want to build out this roster. And we've seen under David Griffin that he's really not that great of a GM. The Cavs fired him because he didn't really have a great tenure with them. And according to Pelicans fans, a lot of the good work that the Pelicans front office did since the David Griffin era has begun was on behalf of Trajan Langdon, who is now in Detroit. So I'm not really sure what the Pelicans are going to be doing this season. I don't really think their ceiling is that high, especially without a center on the roster. They've got the talent on paper to be one of the best teams in the Western Conference, but the fit to me is just not there. And again, David Griffin has had a pretty spotty track record. He's lost this team a lot of very solid role players, and I think he's made some questionable decisions in building this roster. Like, this DeJounte Murray trade is a good example of this, because yeah, they got DeJounte Murray, they got the talent, but like, you added another primary ball handler who doesn't shoot a ton of threes and is not an elite defender anymore to a team that needed three-point shooting and off-ball weapons, as well as a center, and you traded one of your only bigs that could actually play with Zion in that trade. Like, it was some 2K shit that David Griffin was on when he made that trade. You turn the injury sliders off on this team, and they can be one of the best teams in the NBA, because I think Zion at center is only going to not work because of injuries. I actually think he's probably got the physicality to play it just fine. I mean, he's still like 270 pounds probably. Even though he's leaned out this offseason, he's probably still one of the most physically dominant players in the NBA. But we just haven't really seen the Pelicans maximize Zion's strengths yet. And I think a lot of his weaknesses are going to be on full display this season. So I think the Pelicans are kind of cooked. And if I had to slot them anywhere in the Western Conference, I might put them in the play-in, or maybe they get that 6th seed, but I don't think they're getting home court, and I definitely don't think they're contenders this season. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me so much. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and peace.